OG Xbox emulator. Why does it take... How long has this been out? Does no one like the original Xbox?
Just a PC. I've heard this line more times than I can ever recall. It's up there with just use a Raspberry Pi or blast processing on the
For some reason, Xbox emulators were like really rare to come by.
Then why in 2019 can we still not emulate the Xbox?
Unless we're counting the Xbox One.
With a good level of compatibility and performance. Or maybe we can, and we just don't know it yet.
What exactly do you know how to do? I can burp the alphabet.
And in this video, that's what we're going to find out. The Xbox, or DirectXbox as it was originally known by Microsoft, was developed with x86 PC hardware in mind. The Xbox kernel is essentially a custom version of Windows 2000 stripped down to its bare essentials for gaming performance. DirectX 8 is also fully
Dolphin classic.
and includes pixel and vertex shader support. So, if we consider the 6th generation of home consoles, which incidentally is my favorite,
I like this guy's videos.
Consoles of all time, we have
he ported Diablo 1 to the Nintendo Switch.
Each of those systems are very well represented with emulators, especially something like Dolphin, which has an extremely high level of compatibility. So that
just
really
for the hell of it.
Question: where is the original Xbox emulation at? To answer this, we need to go back in time.
That's what I'm wondering.
2003. Back in those days, I was feverishly working on homebrew for the Xbox. At the same time, a developer known as Caustic decided to see if he could write an Xbox emulator that ran on a PC. His initial idea was simple. Rather than base the emulator from the Xbox's kernel, which was fully decrypted and cracked by the way, his emulator, known as CXBX, worked by first reading in the Xbox executable, or XBE, with its own kernel implementation based on high-level emulation. It would then patch any kernel instructions and would generate an executable that would run on a PC. Because many of the API calls on the original Xbox are based on...
You don't even need an Xbox One.
They were mapped over without too much difficulty. And this idea seemed
like you can just get a PC. They have like no exclusive games.
Began to run homebrew. This was very promising since almost all homebrew was developed using the official Microsoft XDK. In other words, the same one that was used to develop commercial games. The thought process.
At least with the PS4, you get some amazing exclusives.
Instructions to the emulator. Slowly, more homebrew and commercial games would begin to run. And initially, that's exactly what happened. By July of 2003, Turok Evolution was able to run its intro movie, and by 2004, it was in-game and playable, with other games like Panzer Dragoon booting into its title screen. It seemed like CXBX would be a slam dunk, and pretty soon there would be a fast and easy-to-use Xbox emulator for the PC. But things, as we will learn, were not so simple. Hijacking the kernel and DirectX API...
Maybe I just wasn't interested.
...turned out to be the wrong initial approach. If you consider a kernel and its API...
Because there wasn't that many
each call begins at some
Xbox games.
One problem with emulating the original Xbox in this fashion...
that were worth
is that
emulating.
XDK releases over time. I believe there were around 30 revisions that were released for the development of different games. This meant that a particular function call that was at a particular address location on one version of the XDK would very likely end up in a different memory location in a different revision of the XDK. And if we consider the original Xbox's 900 games, they were spread over many different XDK revisions.
There was only 900
the
games?
chances of compatibility being high were very, very low, almost zero to be honest. It also meant incompatibilities with homebrew. For example, if the homebrew was developed with one particular XDK revision that CXBX fully supported, but then it was recompiled and updated with a new version of the XDK, the chances are it would not work. And many of the commercial games available for the original Xbox contained customized libraries that were no way being emulated by CXBX's HLE whatsoever. Additionally, because CXBX contains its own implementation of the Xbox kernel, it means that all the Xbox API calls are mapped to Windows 32 API calls. In other words, the emulator is restricted to Windows only. Emulating the hardware via traditional low-level emulation techniques would have solved this problem, but this would require much more time to develop to understand the hardware and chips used inside the Xbox. The Xbox is just a PC, right? So we should be able to just emulate the CPU, the GPU,
Just
and
emulate
on a
CPU,
target Windows
forehead.
machine without too much trouble. Caustic ultimately stopped working on CXPX, and the emulator was left in limbo. It was picked up by other developers such as Blue Shogun 96 and Destian, who kept it alive. More games became playable, such as Futurama and Smashing Drive, but the realization was setting in that CXPX was flawed and would never maintain a high compatibility. One of the biggest reasons
I wonder how good that
Xbox
Futurama
emulation
game
isn't
was.
anywhere near as far
Probably not
along as
good.
it should be. It's because of complacency.
I know
Back in the days
Simpsons
when
Hit
the
and Run
original
was
Xbox
pretty
around,
good.
a lot of people just assumed that emulating an Xbox would be trivial.
From what people tell me.
It's just a PC. But that obviously turned out to be a false assumption. The other thing to mention is that complacency really has been a common thing on the original Xbox itself. And what I mean by that is if we compare it to something like the Nintendo Wii and the Wi-Fi connection that was available for the Nintendo Wii, on the very first day, people were capturing packets, trying to understand how...
Yeah, Nintendo shit was like... It's like always easy to emulate.
Came up with a homebrew solution to establish the
Nintendo has no
Wi-Fi
fucking
connection
idea what
themselves,
they're
utilizing
doing with their
private servers.
consoles.
But back in the day when Xbox Live 1.0...
I think there's even a Switch emulator
no
now.
such investigation or work was ever done to really kind of future-proof and safeguard Xbox Live in the event of any type of downtime or server closure, which is ultimately what happened in 2010.
I think they stopped
But things aren't all that bad.
online services for older consoles for like security reasons.
Developed by Luke Usher.
That's the only reason I can think of.
CXPX Reloaded is a very promising emulator, but as it's based on CXPX, it still uses
And I guess
HLE
less
and its own
server
implementation of the Xbox
capacity, I don't know.
But much work has been done to emulate the Xbox's memory layout, and it's slowly starting to migrate to using LLE, or low-level emulation. As of the making of this video, game compatibility stands at around 37 playable games, with 109 getting in-game. Now this may sound like a low percentage, and
It is a very
but
low
with dedicated
percentage.
people working
For an
on this
emulator?
emulator, I'm expecting to see these numbers increase over the next 12 months. In 2010, another new Xbox emulator appeared known as XQEMU. This is a
How old
complete
is this?
departure from CXPX. It's a low-level emulator that's portable and runs on different hardware. Even recently, there was a port to the Nintendo Switch. This emulator is still in very early stages of development, and unlike CXPX,
And runs like
requires an Xbox
shit on the
kernel
Switch.
BIOS, a boot ROM, a disk image, and an Xbox hard drive image to run. XQEMU is in active development, and compatibility is starting to show great promise.
I don't know, the only good game I can think of, other than Halo, of course, to emulate, would be like Unreal Championship 2.
There is a third emulator.
I can't
that
think
we
of many
haven't really
good
talked
Xbox
about,
games,
and
if
that
I'm being
is the
honest.
official Microsoft emulator that runs backward compatibility for Xbox original games, and it was known
Man, I
as
think
Fusion on the Xbox 360.
Xbox
and
is always the...
on the Xbox One and Xbox
Yeah,
One
Xbox
X.
is always like
When
getting...
Microsoft announced backward compatibility
cucked
for
by
the original
PlayStation.
Xbox on the Xbox 360, they developed an internal emulator known as Fusion, and this matured into the codename Fission for the Xbox One and Xbox One X. Using backward compatibility, these emulators are indeed the best in class, but obviously are closed source and proprietary work that Microsoft owns.
Yeah.
But he's hoping that one day, Microsoft can open up the Fission emulation to run on PCs. I did a deep dive on Fusion in a previous video, so if you want to know all about it and how it works in detail, check it out in the card above. As far as compatibility is concerned, CXPX Reloaded is ahead of XQEMU, but I expect that slowly over time XQEMU will catch up. While both emulators have a low percentage
Health bars don't
compatibility
look
at this
right.
time, some of the games that are playable are impressive. CXPX Reloaded has just implemented
yeah, so far so
high-resolution
good.
mode, and things like Jet Set Radio Future look superb. There's also support for Sega Chihiro arcade hardware, so things like Virtua Cop 3 are playable as well. And finally, CXPX Reloaded has...
I guess
system
Dead or
rules.
Alive
So
3
in
would
other
also
words,
be a
you
good
and some
game to
friends
emulate,
can play
but...
Crimson Skies together with some tunneling software without the need of any Xbox hardware at all. That's pretty impressive. As it stands, things are still some ways off from where they should be. But the future is bright, and I'm expecting good things finally for Xbox emulation in 2019 and
2019.
So there you have it, guys. That's the state of original Xbox emulation in 2019. It's not the best, but it's getting better. And with the two emulators,
It only took
like
fucking
and XQEMU,
20 years,
things are only
almost.
going to improve. There are larger teams of individuals that are behind and working on both of these projects. And really, what I would suggest is, if you want to,
How old is Xbox actually?
Xbox emulation
2003
on your PC or on your Linux machine,
2002.
get behind them. You know, support them on Patreon and really help them out. I'm sure both teams would very much appreciate that. Now, look, I do want to mention that this is not sponsored, or I'm not affiliated with either of these teams. I'm just a fan of, you know, emulation, just like you guys are. So get behind them if this is
I love
something you are
emulation.
interested in. Well, guys, I'm going to leave it here for this video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below.
Emulation is also very important to keep in a lot of older games alive. I wonder if PS5 is going to play all the PlayStation games. I hear it's backwards compatible with PS4 games, but I don't know about what else it's backwards compatible with. Witcher 3 can hit 60 FPS on a Nintendo Switch, okay. Ultra H... Whoa, what? N64 emulation?
In video game
Ultra
emulation history,
HLE.
there are some moments when something truly revolutionary is unveiled that is both applauded and critiqued, even misunderstood, but ultimately something that changes the landscape forever. With the release of the Nintendo 64 in 1996, it came with a 64-bit processor and powerful 3D graphics. Nintendo skipped an entire generation of processor and went straight from 16 to 64 bits. This was the dawn of the 3D graphics era, and the Nintendo 64 came complete with a powerful chip known as the Reality Display Processor, or RDP. Super Mario 64 was the killer launch app and was a smash hit, selling over 11 million copies. It's still considered one of the best games ever, even to this day. But people wondered,
World is
how
better,
to emulate the Nintendo
in my
64
opinion.
on a PC. Back then, emulation was in its infancy. MAME was around the 0.2 release, supporting mostly 8
World 1 and
games.
2 were the
And there
best.
were other emulators like Nesticle that was a fast
Nesticle, I remember that emulator.
DOS. Genesis was an early
Genesis
emulator that was fast even on a
Nesticle.
PC-based machine. Super NES emulation
These
was still
freaking
very early in its
titles.
development. SNES
1997,
96,
Jesus
like
Christ.
merged with SNES 97.
I just remember running these emulators on like
SNES 9X.
when
PC-based
DOS was
PCs had
still a
become
thing.
fast enough to emulate 2D sprite-based 16-bit hardware at good speeds.
Oh yeah, Z-SNES.
Around the same time on the PC,
That emulator's
was the
trash
push
now.
for 3D hardware accelerated graphics. 3D Effects released the Voodoo 1 card in 1997 and quickly followed it up with the dedicated Voodoo 2 card in 1998. Before hardware 3D
Unreal.
acceleration, games were rendered by the CPU in software, which used up CPU cycles. Hardware acceleration.
This is how my computer used to run these
which
games.
used up CPU cycles. Hardware acceleration offloaded the
This is
3D code, leaving the
This might be why I'm like OCD about frame rate sometimes.
Software, which used up CPU cycles. Hardware acceleration
Software
offloaded
render.
the 3D graphics
Yep.
code, leaving the CPU free to do more work. This meant that processor-intensive CPU techniques like particle effects could be easily done on a 3D card for almost free performance. With 3D effects and other 3D chip manufacturers,
IBM Windows not yep.
PC market, and with fast
That takes me
Pentium
back.
and Pentium 2 processors, games like GL Quake and others started to push high frame rates. And people kept wondering if there was ever a possibility of emulating a Nintendo.
I remember when I
64
first got this current PC I have right now,
Most people
I was
dismissed the
so
idea.
fucking happy
There
I
was no
didn't have to
way
deal
it
with this
could be done,
shit.
they said. No way to emulate.
Didn't have to deal with fucking. What did I have previously? Oh, I had Windows Vista previously, and
you'd need at least an 800 megahertz
that was a
machine,
thing.
which was out of the question at the time.
That computer was so shitty too, on top of having Windows Vista.
However, people on Usenet groups would announce Nintendo 64 emulators on the PC all the time. Here's one known as the N64-EMU.
I just remember file, like P2P, it's kind of off topic. I remember like file sharing things like Kazaa and stuff and LimeWire. They would have, this is the song, Eminem, something something. You download it and it's like the wrong song.
Programs developed it, and it ran on a Pentium-based
like,
machine
son of a
at
bitch.
120 megahertz with a 3D card, and how it was coming soon. But this was clearly a fake. Posts like this frequented Nintendo 64 news groups. No one really believed it was possible. The 64-bit instructions and the 3D were so complex that there was no way you could make it run anywhere close to playable speeds. The first real attempt at a public Nintendo 64 emulator was known as Project Unreality. It started development in 1997.
Project
and by early
Unreality?
1998 could
Is
run
it Project
through
64,
homebrew
old
and
title?
into a few commercial games, but the emulator was very slow. Another emulator was announced known as Reality 64.
Oh god, this computer though,
Emulator was
Jesus.
only in very early stages before being discontinued.
Look, it even has like the floppy disk. I wonder if my mouse is getting captured here. No, it's not. Let's go ahead and properties. Oh yeah, it says capture cursor, but it's not showing. Oh god, what did I do? I broke it. Chrome. There we go. Whatever, it's not showing my cursor.
But in January of 1999,
But yeah, it has like the floppy disks on the side, the well, I don't it wouldn't surprise me if modern PCs didn't have CD drives anymore.
but in January
Everything's
of
digital.
1999, history was about to be made.
Oh, this is definitely an old school website too.
Two developers known as Epsilon and Reality Man spent only 3 months.
Like the way
finally
the
releasing
site links are
Nintendo
set up and
64
everything.
Emulator known as Ultra HLE. The emulator took advantage of modern
Pentium 2
processors and 3D effects cards like the Voodoo 3 and claimed full speed or close to full speed.
What was my
performance.
old
The
computer?
public
My
had heard this
Windows
before. Almost
95
every day
to
there was
2000
news
computer.
with another fake Nintendo 64
It was like 800
that was
megahertz
just
and
a
like
virus. When Ultra HLE was
less than
announced,
1
it
gig
was
of
assumed
RAM,
to
I
be the
think.
same. But word had quickly gone around that Ultra HLE was real, and when people booted it up, they were shocked.
It's me, Mario. Hello.
Mario 64 was running on their 200 MHz Pentium 2 PCs, and they couldn't believe their eyes. Simply put, Ultra HLE version 1 allowed you to enjoy Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Star Fox 64, Mario Kart 64, Doom 64, and around 15 other games at amazing speeds, with the occasional glitches here and there, of course, but these two developers had pulled off the unimaginable.
Wow.
Not only that, but because of the
If that's like early
graphics acceleration,
versions,
it meant games
that's
could
actually
be
pretty
upres
impressive.
To 640 by 480, 800 by 600,
If that's
even
early version
1024 by
footage.
768 resolutions, something that the Nintendo 64 hardware itself was not capable of. And playing Nintendo 64 on your PC on a CRT at those resolutions looked amazing. Make no mistake, this was an epic moment for emulation.
I was there the day Ultra HLE was released, and I was one of those people that downloaded it. I was a disbeliever that this emulator was actually real, but when I heard stories that it was real and it was fast as hell, I ended up downloading a couple of ROMs off a dial-up modem at the time, which took hours
Jesus
upon hours
Christ.
for me to actually download. But once I had downloaded these ROMs and started playing them on the Ultra HLE emulator, I was completely blown
Yeah,
away.
90s internet,
So
holy
how did
shit.
Epsilon and Reality Man manage to pull this
90s
off?
internet was so, it was
it
quite something.
How does that happen? Especially considering that the Nintendo 64 to this day struggles on...
Though I never had dial-up. I've only been over places with dial-up.
Pioneered a new approach to emulation. HLE stands for
I did worked for a cable company at the time, so we got
traditional emulation was all low
faster
level.
internet.
In other words, if we look at something like a
I think that's
Neo arcade
how we got
system,
faster
we know
internet.
that there is a Motorola 68000 CPU as its main processor, a Z80 coprocessor, and a Yamaha YM206010 for its sound. All these chips are emulated instruction by instruction in order to reproduce the exact execution of code. This is what is known as low-level emulation or interpreted emulation. Low-level emulation is not fast, but it is very, very accurate. Ultra HLE takes a completely different approach. The main CPU, the MIPS R4300, was emulated instruction by instruction via traditional low-level emulation techniques. However, the RCP or reality coprocessor was handled in a completely different way. HLE works by intercepting high-level API graphics and sounds calls that the games were sending to the RCP chip, and the developers figured out what they were doing and replicated them as best as they could. For example, if we take a look at the Ultra HLE RCP code, we can see these things known as display lists.
They did a really good job with this emulator.
GPU instructions that are loaded and sent to the GPU in batch to be executed.
Especially for the time.
There are display lists for the graphics and the audio. Ultra HLE emulates as best as it can these display lists by intercepting function calls for all the 3D graphics, including vertices, creating triangles and quads, texture mapping, background, culling, and more. The 3D Effects Voodoo Graphics API known as Glide can handle these display lists very easily. In fact, the card works in a very similar way to the Nintendo 64 3D hardware, so porting these instructions to work on the 3D effects was simple to do. This approach meant that performance was fast. With the 3D
He's lucky he
effects
still has an
the
older
display lists,
PC.
a fast Pentium 2 processor could handle the MIPS processor emulation, and thus the high-level emulation techniques was born. The drawback to this approach, however, is that intercepting of these function calls for the 3D graphics would vary game by game. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time has different address locations to where these functions are.
I think all our old
So
PCs have just got thrown in the garbage.
This was done via an INI file. But there's more to
They
this.
were really
the
shitty.
HLE approach was flawed and only ever ran a total of around 20 Nintendo 64 games. While extremely fast, the compatibility percentage of the Nintendo 64 library of games was
I think if you
low.
if you bought a 2019 PC, you could probably play modern games nowadays.
This means that the graphics and audio...
Like a home PC, but I could be wrong.
In other words, to create new effects, optimize 3D graphics, add new channels to audio, and even more. Because microcode was completely customizable.
Okay, you could play them, but they'd be at a shit frame rate.
Not work. Developers such as Factor 5 use custom microcode in games like Rogue Squadron and Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, which incidentally took many years for the current batch of Nintendo 64 emulators to be able to play these games.
I need to upgrade my
After its
PC.
launch, word about Ultra HLE had spread so quickly it was rumored there was around 300,000 downloads of the emulator in the first day. What was meant as a technical proof of concept to outline an exciting new method of emulation turned into most people interested in acquiring illegal copies of game ROMs. Due to the ongoing pressure of this, Epsilon and Reality Man removed Ultra HLE from their website and announced that they would discontinue the emulator.
We do not condone the use of illegal ROMs in any form, and this emulator was not designed to be used for this. The reaction we saw was not the one we expected. It seems the emulation community is not ready for something like this. The Ultra HLE project is now on hold and will be discontinued if this activity continues. Our aim is to develop emulation technology further, not to hurt Nintendo. Without them, none of this would be possible.
In February of 1999, a few weeks after the launch, Nintendo confirmed that they were beginning lawsuit proceedings against Epsilon and Reality Man, with Nintendo singling out the authors in their statement. However, the lawsuit never went to court. Epsilon and Reality Man...
They couldn't sue him for it
There were
anyways.
some rumors
They
that
couldn't.
both landed
You can't
jobs
sue,
at Nintendo working on the GameCube architecture. In
people for
2002,
emulators.
Ultra HLE source code was leaked and gave some good insight into how they managed to utilize the HLE techniques. Reality Man resurfaced in 2000.
I remember there being like a court case with
updates
someone
discussing the next
with
version
like,
of
I don't know,
HLE.
Sony suing like
After a few updates, he disappeared again. In the
Like the
end,
PlayStation
both Ultra
emulation
HLE
team.
never saw another official update. Its legacy and
And it basically failed.
many other Nintendo 64 emulators
Was it
that
Sony?
ultimately
I don't
surpassed the
remember.
compatibility of Ultra HLE,
But yeah, emulators are
but
perfectly
expanded on the very
legal.
same technique that
ROMs
made
are actually
Nintendo 64 emulation
ROMs are actually
a
legal
reality
too.
on
It's just the way people acquire ROMs
So there you have it, guys. That's the story of Ultra
that are
HLE
illegal.
released for the PC in 1999. It was truly a historic and landmark day in emulation history, and one that will go down forever. For those people that remember Nintendo 64 emulation, they'll certainly remember this day.
Philips monitor.
Around back in those days when Ultra HLE was released, surely you must have known about it. And I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below, your stories. What were you doing when Ultra HLE was released? Some of you probably weren't even born when this emulator had come out, but it was really something that truly
Some people weren't even born. Every time I think of, like, I look at, like, 90s stuff, I'm like, damn, there's probably, like, a lot of kids that watch this video and they weren't even born when this is around. Shit. Making me feel old. Alright, that's another good video.